Welcome back, whisky fans. So after I reviewed this year's Whisky Exchange A Fine Christmas Malt, I told myself that I was going to take a break from buying new bottles of whisky. I've got a lot of bottles in the review queue. I've got a lot of videos that need to be edited. Some of them are going back kind of almost a year old now. So there's going to be a lot of old stuff coming out. So I told myself that I was going to have a break from buying new bottles, save a little bit of money and try and get my workload down a little bit. But here we are. So this is a fairly recent release. This is another Whisky Exchange exclusive, kind of one of their seasonal releases. And this is the Whisky Exchange Black Friday 2021 bottling. I am probably going to make this a reasonably brief review though, because December is a very busy month for myself because I've got the premium whisky advent calendar to get through, and also I want to make this a little bit brief so I can get this review out there, because unusually and for some reason there's actually still stock of this stuff available. So anyone that sees this review and they think this is something that they would like, you can actually still buy this. It didn't sell out on the day. There is about 300 bottles left available. So details from the bottle, we don't know a huge amount. We know that it is a single malt Scotch whisky. It's from a mystery Speyside distillery. It's been aged for 22 years. It is bottled at a natural cask strength of 49.2% ABV, and it's one of 1,800 bottles, so reasonably small batch. And it does actually say on the back of my bottle one of 1,800, although I expect they probably all say that. What we don't know is we don't know what distillery it's from. We don't even know what cask types have gone into this. Although, bit of a spoiler, I would guess it's probably either exclusively or predominantly fairly fresh bourbon casks. We also don't know if this whisky is natural colour, although I suspect it probably is. And we also don't know if it's non-chill filtered, because it doesn't mention anything about that on the label. And to be honest, I haven't had a look online because, as Ralphie says, the one place where it matters is on the label. It's the one place where they can't decide to do a U-turn and change their minds. If they want us to know, if they want us to regard it as a craft presentation, it needs to be on the label. Anyway, let's crack the cork, which I've already done. Did actually come with this rather fancy little blue wax on the top, similar to, I think there was green wax on the Christmas bottling. Nice little fancy touch. So let's get some in the glass and see what we've got. I must admit that I'm not a huge fan of Black Friday. It seems very American. It's not. Here in the UK, we don't even celebrate Thanksgiving. So the idea that we're, sorry Americans, but we're kind of having Black Friday forced on us, and it just doesn't seem quite right. And when you look online, a lot of the so-called bargains that you get, if you actually do your research, a lot of the time they're really not bargains. So I think things like this, where you actually get something special, something unique and unusual, you could really say that this is kind of the smart Black Friday purchase, rather than something that supposedly got X amount of money off. Anyway, let's focus on the whiskey in the glass. So the first and most obvious thing with this one is that it's incredibly appley. Very strong notes of apples, although it's not your typical Speyside, which is full of sort of soft orchard fruits. It's also got quite a sharpness to it. It's very spirit forward, very fruit forward. So the kind of apples that you're getting in this one, it's a very sweet and juicy green apple. And there's also quite a nice balance in there, because you've got quite a nice counterpoise of some really strong bitter apple peel notes in there too. Lots of creamy, fruity maltiness. Some really nice sugary raisins. And there's a little bit of spice in there as well. Not the kind of spice that you get from like virgin oak or anything like that. It's not overly woody or overly engineered, even though it is 22 years old. It's just a nice kind of sweet, warming cinnamon toasted spiciness. A little bit like a sweet cinnamon latte. Let's see how it tastes. So colour on this one, I would say it does look like it probably is natural. I'd say light to medium light gold. And on the palate, again, lots of extremely sweet and juicy green apple notes, a little bit softer on the palate than it is on the nose, with some really nice orchard fruits. Really is extremely appley, getting some more of that lovely slightly bitter apple peel coming through again. Lots of lovely creamy maltiness, a really intense fruitiness on the palate, and just lots of really well-aged malty notes. Just going to have one more sip and look at the finish. So finish, I'm going to say medium long. There's a slight salinity to the finish on this one, just a nice little salty edge in the late palate and the finish that just provides some really nice balance against the juicy, sharp, sweet fruitiness that you get on the nose and the palate. Again, more of that creamy malt. You can really tell that this has been in a cask for the full 22 years. Little touch of coffee, and it really just fades away and leaves you with those lovely oily old malt notes. You can tell that it's a really well made, really well aged whiskey. One thing that this whiskey really reminds me of though, and this is something that I don't get all that often, is something like a Calvados. So Calvados is an apple brandy, and when I taste this, it's the best way I can describe it is like, imagine the best Calvados you've ever had and multiply it by 10. I also think it's actually quite reminiscent of some of the better whiskies that you get from the Isle of Arran. I think especially some of the sort of not really old, but the mid-range, so mid-teenage whiskies that you get from Arran, some of the sort of small batch cask strength ones. Some of those actually have that really well-aged malt along with a strong, juicy green apple note. Another thing that this does remind me of a little bit is the April Fool's whiskey from the Whisky Exchange this year. Any regular viewers will know what I mean. This one here, the one that had the UV ink on the label, which when you shine a UV torch on it, it reveals that it's actually not a very young whiskey. It's a 30-year-old whiskey. So this one was also a Speyside single malt. It's a Speyside mystery malt. I would say that the 30-year-old April Fool's whiskey from Whisky Exchange, it actually didn't really taste or smell or come across as a 30-year-old whiskey. I think I said in my review video of this one that it came across more like a whiskey in its low to mid-20s, so more kind of the age of this one here. Whereas this whiskey that they've bottled for Black Friday, I would say that it does seem like the full 22 years. I'd say that the experience matches the age statement on the bottle. I'd also say that if anyone had the 30-year-old April Fool's whiskey, then there are some other similarities with that whiskey in this one. They both seem a similar age. They're both Speyside whiskies, but not overly obviously Speyside, because I think they actually revealed with the April Fool's one that it was matured in bourbon casks, which is a little bit of a curveball for your Speyside whiskies. And this one I think has probably had a similar cask makeup, and I think that the profile between the two is reasonably similar. Could these two whiskies be from the same distillery? It's perfectly possible that they could be, although obviously when we're talking about Speyside whiskey, there are a lot of Speyside distilleries out there, and it's entirely possible that this one and the 30-year-old are from different distilleries. One thing that I did spend a little bit of time looking into is normally Whisky Exchange give you some rather cryptic clues as to where these whiskies are from, and on this one, reading from the back, they said, "Well, we can't tell you anything more about it. Our lips are sealed. What we can say is that it put a smile on our faces and we're sure you'll love it too." So maybe I'm barking up the wrong tree, but that sounds a little bit cryptic, a little bit deliberately worded. So it seems like they're kind of repeating things like lips, faces, smile. The only thing that I could think of is possibly Aberlour. Aberlour is a Speyside distillery, and I think the name Aberlour means something like mouth of the babbling brook in Scots Gaelic. Now, if this is Aberlour, I'd say it's a very atypical Aberlour. It doesn't have the obvious sherry notes that you normally get in the whiskey from that distillery. Although obviously when you get an independently bottled whisky from a distillery, quite often it won't follow that standard house style that the distillery puts out under its own label. But that's about all I could think of, if that even is a clue at all on the label. Other whiskies that I've had that I would say are similar to this, it definitely has some things in common with some of the bottlings that I've had from the Signatory cask strength range from Balmenic. Balmenic is a distillery that you can get reasonably good value bottlings of, especially from Signatory. Balmenic's a distillery that I always look out for, because even though it's a huge distillery with a big output and most of it goes into blends, a lot of the whisky that you can get from there on the independent bottled market tends to be quite good. As for the other Whisky Exchange bottling that we've had recently, the Fine Christmas Malt, which was actually revealed to be a 16-year-old Highland Park, I'd say that this is a very different whisky to the Black Friday edition this year, and very different to the April Fool's 30-year-old bottling as well. Whereas this one's all about that lovely, smoky creaminess. The other two whiskies that we've had from the Whisky Exchange this year are much more fruit forward, much more focused on the malt and on the character of the barley. As for a grade, the Black Friday bottling from Whisky Exchange 2021, 22-year-old Speyside Distillery, going to go with an A-, because I think it's absolutely phenomenal whisky. I don't think I mentioned the price of this. I think it's for sale for about £110 here in the UK. And I think it's expensive, but I think it's probably a reasonably fair price for what you get, because you consider that this is Speyside whisky, it's 22 years old, it's cask strength, and it's a really good whisky. If this had a distillery's label on it, at 22 years old and cask strength, you'd probably be looking at £150, or if it's a prestigious distillery, probably quite a lot more. So I think if you're looking for this sort of whisky and you like your older cask strength whisky, it's a pretty good buy. My only real criticism of this whisky would be that you'd be perfectly valid to say that it's a little bit on the simple side. It's not overly complex, it doesn't change as you go back to it, or not to any huge extent, but it really makes up for that by being a really intense and enjoyable experience from start to finish. I'd say that it's a very straightforward but also a very rewarding whisky, and in a way I'd actually say that it's got the essence of what makes independent bottled whisky great. So I've probably gone on for longer than I intended to. Thank you all for watching, and if you have had this whisky for the Whisky Exchange Black Friday 2021, be sure to let me know what you thought, and I'll see you next time.